So, Doctor, you've been studying the little noticed field of Goan writing in Portuguese.
Yes,
How did you get involved?
Well, I've been looking at it, I guess, for about 3 years now. Initially, my interest came about because I'd finished my PhD looking at specifically Portuguese topics, and I wanted to do something that was connected to what I'd done before, but moved into a different area. So I'd still be working, but I'd be sort of refreshed by engaging with new material. And I've had and have colleagues working on Portuguese language writing from Africa, from Macau and from East Timor. And there was a sort of hole in the map in terms of what I had known about. So I decided to look to see what there was in Portuguese from Goa.
It's pretty much invisible in that sense, even what little exists.
There is very little visibility. I think, again, that's partly due to historical reasons. There was a moment, I think, where the writers who knew and worked in Portuguese were quite active. The first thing I came across was Vimala Devi and Manuel de Seabra's 2-volume Indo-Portuguese literature, which is fascinating. There was a lot of material there.
1972,
I believe. And they've been working on it for about 7 years. I really get the feeling that for both of them, it was a sort of a valedictory sort of work, a sort of taking leave of their interest and past in Goa. But it's a very valuable resource for anybody interested in Portuguese language writing from Goa.
And then, what else did you come across?
There's Elsa the Kosh, there's 3-volume Goan literature.
Yeah.
And I began to...
the former librarian of Central.
Former librarian of Central Library. There's still a 4th volume of that might or might not be coming out.
I see.
And I began to investigate on the internet and find out more about Goa. I have a sort of family connection to Goa, and my father's family were from here. So I knew a little bit, but it was very much limited to family anecdotes and memories. And I became interested when I started to find out more about the complicated language situation here.
Multiple languages and
multiple
literatures.
Complicated, but also very rich.
Yeah.
So this sort of overlapping weave of people working and thinking and engaging with different languages.
More than one language at the same time.
And often more than one language at the same time. I mean, one of the real finds for me here in Goa has been the writing of somebody called Valfrido Antão, who was one of the last journalists in Portuguese. And
I think he was based next to Murmugao, Cortali.
Arosim.
Arosim.
Yeah, he was in Arosim. He sort of talked about his exile in Arosim. I don't know what that. And he's got very.
A lot of Goans have this strange relationship with Goa because when they are outside as part of the diaspora, they think of home in Goa.
Sure.
And when they come here, they miss being out. So.
I imagine it's always the sort of the eternal condition of the immigrant to want to go but having to stay, or to want to stay but having to go, being caught between.
So your current focus is on short stories?
My current focus is on short stories. I had been looking at, I've been looking at things quite widely, but then I decided that I needed to sort of narrow down what I was doing. And really what interested me the most were the short stories. Novels in Portuguese are very few and far between.
Like, for example?
3. In terms of short stories, I found initially Vimala Devi's own short stories, a very accomplished collection published in 1963. The stories of a writer called Epitácio, Pais, who, again, I think was for a long time sort of vanished from memory in Goa, but I think there are a couple of people starting to discuss what he did now.
It's very tragic in the sense that when he was alive, he wasn't recognized, and people realized the quality of his writing after he passed away in 2009.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I could quite term it a regret, but I do realise that in a sense I'm slightly late. You know, if I was,
we all are.
I think we all are. But a couple of years ago, these people were still alive and would be contactable. But there are still a lot of people around that have memories and connections with it.
Yeah, it's better late than never and not too late. So you spoke to his family yesterday, and you also spoke about 2 other writers. That was Elsa and
I talked about Vimala Devi.
Yeah.
I talked about Epitácio, and I talked about another writer from Goa called Maria Elsa de Rocha. Maria Elsa de Rocha. Another very interesting writer, who was also writing in the 1960s. One of the things that drew me to the short story in Goa was the sort of curious relationship it had to the press. It was it moved away from a sort of hermetic literature that's produced to be published in book form to approach a sort of intervention in people's lives, in actualities, where it sort of bounced off what was happening in Goa, what was being discussed in the newspapers, what was around in the area at the time.
So you're saying the fact that it got published in a press shaped the kind of literature that was generated?
I think it did. I mean, of course, short stories, as in the modern form of the short story. I mean, there's lots of currents which produced short stories we know today, one of which, of course, was the folk tale, which had to be short because it was a tale that was told in one sitting.
Yeah.
But another major factor was the press. I mean, the American and British short story evolved as a form that was printed in the press.
I see.
And of course, later there would be sort of collections and it became more book-based. But I think, there's something interesting about the space constraints of a newspaper that's particularly, and the way of sort of producing things regularly. Not just actually in Goa, importantly, not just for newspapers, but for a radio program that existed on All India Radio, Renaissance or Renaissance Rebirth.
Yeah.
That was also a very fecund site for Goan writing, for Goan short stories in Portuguese.
But the problem with writing coming from a small culture, as I see it, like Goa, is that you're never sure how it compares to the wider scheme of things. Because at one level it's so particular, so localized, and it may not be appreciated or it may be highly overrated. How do you look at the field?
In terms of what I've been looking at, I have tried to... Actually, it's one of the difficulties I've found in my work is that just writing about, just studying and producing academic work about Goan writing in Portuguese is interesting to me, but there's only a small group of people interested in it.
How do you localize it in a wider context?
Yeah, I think it's how do you start to fit it into a framework that can draw people from other fields and draw people with other interests. One thing I've tried to do in my writing in Britain is to try to set Goan writing in Portuguese in context of a general development of different literatures in Portuguese, whether it be Brazilian, Angolan, Cape Verdean, which is a very interesting comparison for Goa.
Why?
Because it's also Goa is a particular culture that is part of, yet has a complicated relationship to a wider Indian culture, in that Goans are Indians, but feel themselves to be slightly different because of history and because of other factors.
Right.
So belonging to a greater body, but also having a very distinctive personality. And the Cape Verdeans have the same relationship towards Africa.
I see.
In that they're, on the one hand, they're African or of African origin, but they're sort of this island people. There's been an intermixture of races. They speak Creole, as their native language. Also the diglossia between a Creole, which is the spoken language, Portuguese, which is the sort of the official language, and how the two interrelate with each other, which can be compared to, let's say, Konkani and Marathi and Portuguese and English. So yeah, that's something I've tried to do, to set, so for instance, Vimala Devi, I discussed her stories in relation to stories arising in Angola and Mozambique, which were similar and different, and that's the interesting thing.
I see.
How are they similar and how are they different? And that sort of helps us have a more nuanced idea of the development of writing and the conditions produced by Portuguese colonialism in different parts of the world. So rather than considering it as something that was monolithic and unchanging, something that was always produced in different ways at different times, different ways in relation to different local realities. One of the things that I'm thinking about how to do now is what's the best way of discussing Goan literature in Portuguese, not just in relation to other literatures in Portuguese, but in relation to other Goan literatures. Because of course there's a very large, ever-growing body of work in English, in Konkani and in Marathi. I don't know if Marathi writing is as strong as it used to be. And it's very difficult. I mean, how do you discuss, how do you put one literature in the centre without hierarchising your discussion? And I think when I started out thinking about how I could deal with Goan literature, I thought it would be enough to just have references to other literatures. The problem is then for a reader that isn't very conversant or familiar with Goa, there's a certain tendency to assume that, for instance, Goan literature in Portuguese is the principal important literature, and these other things are just secondary. I think it's a problem that's arisen in some writing about Goan literature in English that sort of maybe sidelines things written in Konkani and Marathi and Portuguese a little too much. and I don't want to repeat the same thing.
Yeah.
There's no point just doing the same thing but inverted. So that's the problem I'm still dealing with. I'm not quite sure how I'll deal with it, but it's going to be interesting trying.
Yeah.